Chapter 18. Larina. Scrambling down off her mountain of gold, Larina pelted towards the huge blockade of fallen boxes and splintered walkways. A straggling skeleton that had somehow avoided the collapse reared up at her, and she peppered it with shots from her pistol until it fell apart. Try as she might, however, she could find no way through the fallen debris, and was left pounding her fists uselessly against the barricade that separated her from her crew. She was only vaguely aware that she was bellowing Adelaide's name over and over again. The wood was becoming hotter and hotter beneath her hands, and she realized that she could no longer see the roof of the chamber, for it was now obscured by a thick, roiling cloud of smoke. The torches, she thought in panic. All it would have taken was for some of the dry and ancient wood to topple onto a brazier during its collapse, and the whole pile would soon be one gigantic bonfire. Her funeral pyre, if she didn't escape. Gazing upward, she could see the fallen masonry beginning to singe as flames licked across its edges. She pulled a handkerchief from her pocket, wetting it with water from her flask, and was tying it securely over her mouth and nose when she heard a noise. A loud crash echoed from the other side of the divide, then another, and a spark of hope flared within Larina's heart. She imagined little Ned on the far side heaving away chests and clearing a passage for her so that they might escape together, and began to scrabble at the debris on her side, seeking where the commotion was loudest. "Ned!" she shouted. "Can you hear me? Is Faisal okay?" A hand burst through the wreckage, reaching aimlessly for a moment before retracting, but Larina could tell immediately that it didn't belong to Ned, not unless he'd lost an awful lot of weight. She staggered backward, torn by two conflicting desires, as the gold hoarder's face leered at her through the gap. Part of her wanted very much to avenge herself upon the monster that had killed her captain, but she knew that her pistol needed reloading, and besides, there was a little matter of the chamber being on fire. She doubted very much that smoke and flames would slow the gold hoarder, but she could already feel her lungs burning as they took in more of the acrid smoke. Flight was her only option then, and quickly. She turned as the glittering skeleton began to heave himself through the gap in the burning barricade and sprinted back across the golden landscape. It was tough going, for the collapsed treasure spread across the floor to create a treacherously unstable surface where coins and gems shifted underfoot. Twice she stumbled, all too aware of the clattering from behind her as the gold hoarder dragged himself upright, and twice she scrambled to her feet. She almost ran straight past the secret passage she'd found earlier, spotting it only at the last second, only to find an escape route denied her. Spilled coins had cascaded across the entrance and into the passageway itself, blocking it in a golden landslide. Even if she'd been left in peace, Larina doubted she'd be able to dig her way out before the flames and fumes overcame her. As it was, with a crazed skeleton bearing down upon her, in large, loping strides, escape through the passageway was not an option. Wheezing, her eyes stinging, Larina took a few clumsy swipes at the approaching gold hoarder with her sword, scooping up a handful of money and flinging it at his face to distract him, while she darted under his arm and backed the way she came. The hulking figure hissed angrily as she picked up the gold, his head darting backward and forward as he made a futile effort to track the flight of every last coin. By the time he turned to pursue, Larina was already back at the blockade, diving through the gap the creature had dug for itself and tucking herself into a roll that ended rather painfully when she collided with yet another pile of treasure. This side of the ruined chamber was both brighter and hotter, the fires burning more intensely. Rivulets of liquid gold were beginning to trickle out from the piles closest to the flames, and for a moment, Lorena had a vision of the whole chamber acting as an enormous melting pot, transforming every piece of treasure into part of a flowing golden mass that would stream along the passageways and drop relentlessly into the abyss beyond. The greatest fortune ever known, lost forever due to a moment's misfortune. Shining. Hold it together, she commanded herself, aware how light-headed she was feeling, as she forced herself to focus. Adelaide's body, she noticed with a jolt, was gone. There was no sign of Faisal either, though to her relief, Lorena spotted a scrap of his coat snagged on the very edge of the wreckage. She hoped that Ned had been able to pull him free, and that the two of them were already well on their way to the surface. A sudden movement caught her eye, and she realized that the last of the gold hoarder's minions still lingered, shambling around in a pack and making vain attempts to snuff out the flames with their feet. She took down the first while it was still intent on its task, knocking aside the arm of the second skeleton as it lunged toward her, still dripping flecks of molten gold it had been carrying in its fleshless fingers. The third took her by surprise, for it had been lurking out of sight behind the golden throne, and Lorena bellowed in alarm as it leapt upon her. She pitched forward, her face only inches away from a stream of boiling metal. Arcing backwards to keep her face away from the floor, she wedged the barrel of her pistol underneath her own arm, with the barrel facing backward, hoping there was one last shot left within its chamber. To her relief, she felt the heat of the shot against her and heard the splintering of old bones. Rolling out from under the skeleton that had pinned her, which she was pleased to see was now missing its left arm, Lorena scrambled upright and lashed out with her foot. The kick carried her assailant backward, into yet more of the fallen crates, which toppled down upon it with a satisfying crunch. Lorena fumbled to reload her pistol, but that seemed to be the last of the undead underlings, and she backed cautiously toward the passageway they'd used to reach the chamber. She was almost to the exit when she spotted Adelaide's fallen knife, its dark handle a stark contrast to the gold coins on which it lay. She wasn't sure why she did it, but Lorena knelt down to retrieve the little blade, now perhaps the only memento of her fallen crewmate, and slipped it carefully into a loop on her belt. As she stood, there was an almighty crash from behind her, and great chunks of the burning wreckage gave way, sending embers and splashes of gold across the room. Lorena felt the burning flecks land upon her skin and hair and quickly drop to the ground, rolling uncomfortably back and forth across the flagstones until the last of the white-hot sparks were extinguished. She looked up, and there was the gold hoarder, standing with its shovel raised atop the collapsed portion of the barricade. It gave one mighty leap and landed with a great crash in front of the chamber's exit, while Lorena was still struggling upright. The green jewels in its eyes shone vindictively as it tilted its head this way and that, as if studying her. Its jaw dropped open, but rather than the animalistic roar she'd been expecting, there were words, slow and ponderous words, sibilant and dry as a crypt. "Treasure," it hissed. "Thieves." It can talk, Lorena thought, astonished. If it can talk, maybe that means I can bargain with it. "We didn't come here to steal from you," she called, coughing from the smoke-filled air. "We thought this was Athena's fortune, the treasure of the pirate lord. She wasn't sure what she'd said wrong, but these words seemed to enrage the gold hoarder even further. The blade of its shovel lashed out, carving through one of the endless treasure piles, and she barely leapt backwards in time. Larina responded by diving sideways and circling, trying to keep her distance as her pistol sang out. She needn't have bothered reloading, it seemed, for her first shot struck the creature's glittering lower jaw. But the gold hoarder took no notice. The second struck a glancing, harmless blow along its cheekbone. The third did nothing but leave a dent in the shovel's blade as the gold hoarder began to wield the tool like a shield. Firearms, Larina realized, weren't going to be enough. Whatever dreadful ambition had compelled the gold hoarder to amass its unimaginable fortune over the years seemed to give it far greater fortitude than the others of its kind. Even the rusty blunderbusses adorning the walls of Wilbur's weapon shop would struggle to slow it down, she thought grimly. Remembering the distant outpost and its denizens struck a fresh wellspring of rage within her, and all she could see reflected in the shovel was Adelaide's shocked expression in her final moments. Now it was Larina who went on the offensive, lashing out against the gold hoarder with blow after vicious blow. Her cutlass dented and sparks flew as its whirling blade struck against the skeleton's gem-studded body. "You killed my captain!" she roared. "You belong dead!" The gold hoarder threw its head back in an obscene parody of human laughter, the sound echoing throughout the ruins and filling the smoky air. With a single shove, it brought the handle of its shovel up to meet Larina's cutlass, and her blade stuck fast in the wood. Wide-eyed, she released her grip on the sword just in time, for the cackling cadaver gave an almighty tug that would have wrenched her off her feet and tossed her effortlessly into the roaring flames. That left Larina unarmed, save for her pistol, which she unloaded ineffectively at the grinning visage of the gold hoarder, before finally resorting to throwing the weapon itself at his head. The undead monster delivered another mighty swing of its shovel, and Larina dodged again, but her throat was raw now, her eyes puffy and swollen. If she didn't reach the safety of the passageway soon and seek refuge from the smoke and fumes, she was going to collapse and be lost beneath the rising tide of flowing gold, assuming the gold hoarder didn't rip her apart first. At least Faisal and Ned will live on to tell everyone what happened, she thought. And then she had an idea. "It doesn't matter what you do to me," she goaded, calling out to the gold hoarder, though it hurt to speak. "My crew are on their way back to the surface right now with the rest of your treasure. They'll spend it in so many places, you'll never get it all back. And they're going to tell everyone what's left down here. Imagine that. 10,000 thieves, all coming for their share of your fortune, and you'll never, ever be able to stop them all." Enraged, the gold hoarder raised its deadly shovel high overhead, assuming the same stance that had felled Adelaide. It brought the jagged blade down toward Larina, using every ounce of its strength. But she was no longer there, having flung herself forward between two bony legs. The shovel's blow struck the barricade, causing great piles of flaming wood to tumble down atop the gold hoarder. But his fury was such that he shrugged off the heavy blows and lumbered after his prey. Coughing and spluttering as she sprinted toward the exit, Larina paused only long enough to pluck up a length of wood and thrust it into the roaring flames. The result was a crude torch, her only defense against the all-consuming blackness that lay ahead. She had the unpleasant feeling that the gold hoarder would be able to see just fine in the dark. She made it back to the room where they'd made camp just in time, driving the sputtering firewood like a stake into the ground and casting around for the lantern she'd left behind, until at last, her questing fingers curled around its familiar handle. The steady glow of its flame was a welcome relief, and as she clipped it to her belt and prepared to move on, she could hear the distant sound of booted feet advancing along the corridor behind her. She also took hold of a stout woodcutter's axe that must have belonged to whoever had made camp here all those years ago, for it felt good to have a weapon clutched in her hands again as she sprinted through the gloom. At last, Lorena came to the great ravine that they'd crossed before. To her relief, she saw that the decaying bridge was much as they'd left it, although one of the ropes they'd previously clung to seemed to have given way. She'd feared that Ned and Faisal's escape might have collapsed the entire thing, trapping her forever in the darkness with a murderous skeleton. Even so, she hesitated at the cliff's edge, shuddering at the memory of lying sprawled on those planks with nothing but a few lengths of rotten wood between her and howling oblivion. It took another hiss from the gold hoarder, who sounded uncomfortably close behind her, to compel Lorena's feet onto the bridge. The first of the remaining planks held her securely as she inched forward, as did the second. She clung tightly to the handrail, barely daring to breathe as she took step after heavy step across the divide. The third bowed under her weight, but held. The fourth plank gave way a few moments after she'd stepped on it, and a white-lipped Lorena increased her pace yet again, finally breaking into a trot, when the far side of the ravine was just a few feet away. Finally, she gave one almighty bound for safety, dropping the axe as she landed roughly on the bare rock face. Her landing added to her cuts and bruises, but she didn't care. She turned and found she could make out the gold hoarder in the darkness, for its glittering jaw and hand shone in the light of her lantern. To her surprise, it had already stepped onto the furiously swaying bridge. She watched the monster progress, certain that its footholds must surely collapse at any moment. The alternative, that the vengeful skeleton might somehow make it across the ravine, was unthinkable. Lorena felt utterly drained and knew that she'd never make it back to the surface before the creature caught up to her and brought its mighty shovel crashing down. This chasm might be the only chance she had to put an end to the pursuit once and for all. The skeleton's boot struck heavily upon the second plank, which creaked alarmingly under the sudden weight. "Come on," Lorena thought, staring intently at the bridge, as if she could force it to collapse through sheer willpower. Just as she hoped, the third plank did indeed give way as the gold hoarder stepped closer. Better still, the ravages of time seemed finally to have caught up with the decaying structure. One by one, the rest of the wood splintered and fell away, leaving the gold hoarder clinging to one last rope that spanned the ravine. She watched with some considerable pleasure as the skeleton struggled to keep a grip, its shovel crashing down into the darkness below. The gleaming skull turned toward her as Lorena watched defiantly, and then back to the handrail. Taking the taut rope in its jaws, the gold hoarder bit down, severing the line to which it was clinging. Now it was no longer dangling helplessly, but swinging toward her side of the canyon in a large arc with its legs braced for impact. She heard, rather than saw, the creature strike the cliff with a loud clatter and a hiss. Peering down into the darkness, she could make out the skeletal form as it began to climb the rope, hauling itself up, hand over hand, and hissing more angrily than ever. Lorena's hand flew to Adelaide's knife, and she knelt on the very edge of the cliff, back braced against the rocky pillar to which the rope had been anchored. Her only chance at survival, she knew, was to cut the cord and send the ghoulish creature into the abyss once and for all. Strand by strand began to peel away as she worked furiously with the little blade, but the enraged skeleton was getting closer by the second. Now she was halfway through the rope, and the gold hoarder's hands were 10 feet away from the edge of the cliff. 3/4 done. Almost there. 3 strands left. The rope snapped. The gold hoarder leapt. Lorena screamed as a golden hand seized her leg, claws raking across her flesh as the skeleton dangled. The pain and pressure as it clung to her limb like a lifeline was intense, and she was forced to hook her other leg around the pillar, which was all that stopped her from sliding across the floor and being dragged into the ravine. She flailed around, desperately looking for something to hold on to, for the gold hoarder weighed far more than one might expect from a pile of old bones and rags. "It's the gold," she thought, fighting through the red fire of exhaustion. "Gold is really heavy metal. Heavy, but soft." Her hands closed around the woodcutter's axe, and Lorena brought it down upon the claw that held her leg, issuing a cry to rival the gold hoarder's own angry roar as the blow struck the creature mere inches from her own flesh. The creature scrabbled furiously at the cliff face with its other hand, realizing her intention, and Lorena felt her grip on the rock give way. She began to slide inexorably toward the cliff edge, inches away from their mutual doom, and panic swelled within her. Clamping down on the feeling, she summoned up the last of her strength and brought the axe down for one last live-or-die attempt. This time, the blade sliced unstoppable through the golden hand until it struck stone. The gold hoarder had no expression to read, and its jaw hung open in surprise as it plummeted into the darkness, reaching for Lorena with a hand it no longer possessed. The hand was still squirming on the ground nearby, and she lashed out at it with a savage kick, consigning it to the void along with its owner. Only then did she slump fully to the floor, poking gingerly at her injured leg and wincing. Her eyelids were heavy, and she yearned for sleep, but not as badly as she yearned for daylight and the smell of the sea. Lorena permitted herself to sit only for a moment before getting unsteadily to her feet, testing her weight on her wounded limb. It was then that she noticed the ring, little more than a glimmer in the darkness, and pinched it up between her fingers to examine the black diamond set against the band. She pocketed it without much thought and staggered back through the ruins, taking the endless staircase at her own reduced pace. After some time, she no longer needed the lantern to see. Stepping out of the shadow of the fallen statue and into the warmth of a sunny morning felt even better than she'd imagined it would, and Lorena wished for the shade of a palm tree so that she might sit and slumber for a while. "You can rest in the tavern when you're safely home," she told herself. "Today's story ought to be good for a grog or two." She knew that the Unforgiven must be far away by now, Faisal and Ned having made their escape long before she escaped the gold hoarder's clutches. Quite how she was going to find her way home was a puzzle that stumped Lorena for a while, at least until she remembered that the pirate crew that had ambushed the crew of the Unforgiven had come here in a ship of their own. She limped along the coastline until she could see the sails of the mercenaries' galleon, still bobbing peacefully off the coast, at which point she waded out to sea. The salt water stung the cuts on her leg, where the gold hoarder had grabbed her, and once she was aboard, she shrugged off her coat, tugged at her breeches, and tended to the wound properly. Next, she raided the ship's supplies until she found something she could eat that wouldn't kill her, which turned out to be bananas. After hours underground, fighting for her life, they were the sweetest thing she'd ever tasted. Working a galleon meant for a crew of 4 proved to be tricky, but not impossible. And once Larina had strained to raise the anchor and partially unfurl a sail, so she could see where she was steering, she found herself able to lean against the helm and let the ship's compass guide her way. As long as she didn't have to fight, she'd make it home. Her leg was feeling better, and her spirits were lifting slightly, though her mind still drifted back to Adelaide and the others from time to time. She would have to sell the ship when she made it back to an outpost, she decided. Then, well, perhaps she'd buy a little sloop she could manage on her own. She wasn't certain she was ready to find another crew, not so soon after her first disastrous voyage. If I had only let Faisal and Ned walk past me when I first landed at Sanctuary Outpost, she thought bitterly, they would never have been able to reach the map, and Adelaide might still be alive. She shook her head, refusing to let herself wallow in might-have-beens, and focused on the horizon that was in front of her. A horizon, she realized, that had sails on it. Another galleon was sliding into view ahead of her, previously hidden from sight by the rocks of the nearest island. She was already altering her course to try to avoid a confrontation when she spotted the figurehead, a fearsome woman holding 2 crossed pistols. Letting out an unintended, joyful laugh at the sight, Larina dashed all around her stolen ship, weighing anchor and getting as close to the island as she could for a better look. It was definitely the Unforgiven. She could even make out Ned and Faisal roving around on the shoreline gathering food and supplies for the return journey. It felt better than she expected to see them again, and barely had they spotted her approach before Larina had abandoned ship, diving overboard to meet her crewmates. They reunited in the surf, and Larina was startled but not displeased to find herself picked up bodily by little Ned for a bear hug. Together they made their way back aboard and clustered around the map table to tell their stories. Faisal seemed no worse for wear, so Larina demanded to know why he hadn't been crushed under the tumbling masonry deep within the ruins. "I have a very thick skull, yes," he said, by way of explanation, "and my good friend Ned was kind enough to break my fall with his head." "We'd have come back for you, but we thought you was dead," Ned added apologetically. "And I, for one, do not believe that the gold hoarder was about to let us form a search party," Faisal declared. "To see a skeleton lord such as he up close is not a sight I shall soon forget. I expected him to chase us all the way back to the ship." "Well, I don't think he'll be bothering anyone, at least not for a while," Larina said, a trace of pride creeping into her voice. As they listened attentively, she told them all about the collapse, the fight, the escape, and the battle at the bridge when she finally put an end to the monster's pursuit. "Such a pity," Faisal said sympathetically. "To think of the largest fortune any of us have ever seen lost down there, possibly forever. We were unable to grab more than a handful of coins, enough to repair and refit the ship, perhaps, but hardly Athena's fortune." He pointed across at a distant fog bank. "From the crow's nest I could see the Devil's Shroud appear to be advancing, perhaps even moving in to claim this place. I think perhaps we will be the last ones to come here for some time." His expression grew serious then, and he leaned forward across the map table. "We have a long journey home," he declared, "and we are once more a crew of 3. Would you, Larina, consent to being the acting captain of the Unforgiven? Shocked, Larina looked back and forth between them, unable to tell if they were joking. Me? You want me to be the captain? We need a steady hand upon the helm, and I see no reason why it should not be the mighty pirate who single-handedly fought off the gold hoarder, Faisal said encouragingly. At least until Adeline returns. Larina stared at him, uncertain if he was cracking or simply making a joke in very poor taste. Adelaide's dead, Faisal, she said, as gently as she could manage. Now it was Faisal's turn to look at her, as if she were playing some cruel joke, and the two of them stared at each other in mutual incomprehension for a moment. Ultimately, it was Ned who broke the deadlock. Faisal, he said, a low rumble of mirth making his shoulders quake. I don't think anyone's ever told Larina about the Sea of the Damned. Emotions appeared to be fighting for control of Faisal's expression, and Larina felt like she was going to launch herself across the table at whoever said the next thing she didn't understand. What? She growled dangerously. Is the Sea of the Damned? And so help me, if either of you laugh at me, I'll— Forgive us, Faisal interrupted, holding his hands up in supplication. Sometimes I forget that you are still new to the Sea of Thieves, though you have had quite a maiden voyage. Let us try to explain. Larina marshaled what little patience she had left, while Faisal settled back with his arms behind his head, deep in thought. You must understand that what I am about to say is the result of much conjecture and half-remembered experiences, he said slowly. No one truly understands the Sea of the Damned. Not really. And I hope you will come to understand why no one really enjoys talking about it. We do not even know if the place has a real name, if it itself is completely real. He caught Larina's glare and continued his story. Whatever it may be, the Sea of the Damned takes the form of a vast, dark ocean whose waters are icy to the touch. There are no stars to chart by and no sun with which to tell the time. You cannot see the horizon, as there is only ever an endless fog through which vague shapes can be seen but never reached. Down in the waters, if you look closely, you can see writhing shapes that seem to be neither mer nor human. Are they the spirits of the dead? Could they be the same lost souls who find their way back to our world and plague us as skeletons? Some would say so, but who knows for sure? When you wake up in this strange place, you have a body and you have your belongings, but you are not quite alive either, caught between two worlds perhaps, on the deck of a ship that is not your own, a galleon that sails this endless ocean. She is an ancient ship with a strange creature for a figurehead, and her walls and railings are marked with the names of some who have sailed in her before you. This was sounding more and more like a ghost story to Larina, but she found herself captivated by the idea nonetheless. A ship? Does it have a crew? Indeed. They are gaunt and bloodless, shambling and obedient, for their captain is a tall and fearsome man with wild hair and an outfit that seems as ancient and ragged as his ship. The first time you encounter him, you wonder if you are perhaps his prisoner, or if you have been plucked from oblivion to serve as a deckhand on his endless voyage through limbo. In truth, You are more like a passenger rescued from an unknown fate."
"That's why we call it the Ferry of the Damned,"
Ned cut in.
"The captain hardly ever speaks, though. Suppose he's not got much to talk about except how he's sick of the job."
"And where the door to the captain's cabin should be," Faisal persisted, "there is a great portal, sealed tight with no lock or handle, and so you remain aboard until the ship's captain, your ferryman, decides the time is right. That is when the door will open in a burst of light, true light, from the living world. And when you step through—"
"You wake up,"
Ned shuddered.
"and it feels like you've had the worst dream of your life."
"He just lets you go?" Lorena's eyebrows were raised in surprise. "I'd expected you to tell me he takes your soul as payment or something. What does he do it for?" Faisal shrugged. "Everyone has their own ideas, of course. Some say that he is paying off a great debt, or that he is cursed somehow. Others that he is searching for his lost love, and will cast those of us he finds back to the land of the living like a fisherman of souls. I think that perhaps it is wiser not to ask him too many questions. Do not bite the hand that feeds you. Yes?
"And we know dead used to just mean dead,"
Ned added, ominously.
"Which is why the tavern ain't stuffed with pirates from the olden days. No one wants to take the ferryman for granted and muck about in case next time he ain't there to save you."
Lorena imagined desperately treading water in an endless, ethereal ocean, calling and pleading as the ferryman stared implacably down at her, and then turned the ship's wheel, vanishing into the fog and leaving her soul to sink beneath the waves. Despite the heat of the day, she shivered. "You mean to tell me that Adelaide is on this ferry of the damned right now, waiting for the door to open? What if she's not allowed through?" "Then that will be the start of another adventure, perhaps," Faisal said guardedly. "One we may all have to face one day when we are very old or very sick, and the ferryman decides he would prefer not to take us aboard. Until then, we must forge ahead in her name and hope that she finds her way back to us. At least there is still hope that we will see her again. Yes?" Lorena was trying to take all of this in. She still had 1,000 questions that she suspected there were no answers for, at least for now. A world of lost souls and skeletons, ghoulish ferrymen, and the dead coming back to life? She stood up. "As acting captain," she said firmly, "I say we go and wait for Adelaide at the nearest tavern. I need a very, very large drink."